Okay, hi everybody. This is a panel hosted by the UCSC chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society, an organization dedicated to hosting the conversation on the left. Our motto is "The left is dead, long live the left," and to those ends we hold public fora, reading groups, coffee breaks, publish a print journal, and try and organize a critical discussion around the issues that are facing the reconstitution of a vital left today. So today's panel is on the topic of decolonization. I feel like it's just sort of been in the air on campus over the past few years, obviously because of the encampments, and then there's also been... Sorry,
my bad. My phone just turned off.
Oh, okay. And then there's also been, kind of these dynamics recently in Latin America and, with Iran and this question of national self-determination in the U.S. And it just seems like something that's, I think, been on a lot of people's minds. So I wanted to have each of the panelists give, opening remarks. We ask that you don't go past 8 minutes, but just say your general thesis on the role decolonization plays for the left. And, is it the same as it was in the period of decolonization in the 20th century and the Cold War? How has that changed now that we live at a time beyond that classical period of decolonization, but there's still sort of struggles for national self-determination? Are they of the same nature in the 21st century that they were in the 20th century? So just kind of keeping the 20th century in mind, and then today, and what this means for the practical activity of the left. So can we start just from Elio to David? I'll introduce all the panelists as well, I guess, probably now, huh? So Elio is a fourth-year community studies major. After participating in the encampment, he was arrested and banned from campus alongside over 100 students and faculty. Elio became plaintiff in a lawsuit against UCSC because of this, where he met Rachel Lederman, a movement lawyer with Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. Elio later worked alongside Rachel on a lawsuit defending youth skaters against SFPD's unlawful mass arrest in 2023. And I'll just go down and introduce everybody else. And next we have, to the left of Elio, David Walters, a co-editor with Tim Davenport of the Selected Works of Eugene V. Debs, a 6-volume set currently in publication through Haymarket Books. Walters is a founding member and director of Marxists.org and is the primary administrator for the Eugene Debs, Daniel De Leon, and Trotskyism archives. Walters' career also includes time in the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers and at the Holt Labor Library. And we have Shaun Terry. Shaun Terry is a PhD student in history of consciousness and a communications scholar and political theorist. We have David Lau. David Lau is a poet, essayist, and editor, a continuing lecturer at College 9, where he's taught since 2007. His books are Virgil and the Mountain Cat and Still Dirty. He is the co-editor of Lana Turner, a journal of poetry and opinion. His poetry and essays have appeared in many publications, including New Left Review, Boston Review, Literary Hub, and The Margins. And lastly, on Zoom, we have Richard Rubin joining us from Massachusetts, who is a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. So without further ado, let's start off with you, Elio.
Hi guys, I'm Elio. I'm a community studies major, which is a unique major to Santa Cruz. I got involved in the major because I thought it would give me more opportunity to experience hands-on learning, learn about organizing, learn about the particular history of organizing at Santa Cruz and in California. And then I joined the Worker Student Solidarity Coalition in October of 2023 when Israel escalated the genocide in Gaza. Worker Student Solidarity Coalition works with student orgs and worker unions to build solidarity across campus and in the Santa Cruz community. And that work got me involved in the encampment in 2024. I was mostly associated with WISC at this time, but also other organizations like SJP and stuff. And our job, WISC, ended up being it was a lot of work facilitating discussions, facilitating consent, like facilitating decision-making processes and like building consensus, like building relationships with unions and workers, allowing student workers to organize their union in the encampment. Then I got arrested at the raid. They banned everyone from campus for 2 weeks. After that, like just if you had your name in the system, like the university sent you a letter saying you could not come back to campus or you could be arrested again. And then I was asked to be a plaintiff in the lawsuit that Rachel Lederman initiated with the ACLU, suing the university for violation of due process in affecting those bans. No other UC campus did the same thing when they raided. No other UC campus enacted bans in that way when they were doing the raids of the encampments across the UC system, so it was very unique. That lawsuit resulted in policy change, and then my community studies program for the capstone requirement is a field study, 6-month field study in a nonprofit or community-oriented organization. So I chose to work for the Center for Protest Law and Litigation because I got connected to Rachel, who is like senior counsel for that org under the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. They're based in Oakland. They do a lot of great work responding to current issues in the Bay Area that need legal attention and legal support. They did a lot of work for Golden Gate 26, Stanford 11, Black Lives Matter movements in 2020. There's still some ongoing litigation. And then the case that I worked on was the mass arrest of 117 mostly Hispanic young boys at the Dolores Park Hill Bomb in 2023. And that's it. Yeah.
Okay, so now moving on. Let's hold the applause till the end, all the speakers. Now moving on to David Walters.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me again to this. Not quite the same issue as the Palestine Middle East question I think I spoke last at, which I think was the last forum here, which rises a lot of passion in me. More dispassionately, if you leave this forum tonight, I think, and you're still interested in decolonization, you should read The Wretched of the Earth if you haven't read it already by Frantz Fanon. He synthesizes what oppression is about in the colonial period. In his case, I guess it was Algeria primarily, which fought a vicious civil war. 1 million people died in the 1950s, and the best, in my opinion, political film ever made, Battle of the Algiers, was part of that. And one of the leaders of it was actually an actor in the film itself. So decolonization starts the term. I didn't hear the term, I don't know, I don't remember when I heard the term. Maybe during Occupy Oakland back in 2011, was it 2010? We had a big banner that says, decolonize Oakland. And I go, Oakland's a colony? Yeah, I couldn't figure that out. I mean, I've been around, you know, I'm part of the left. I just never really contemplated the term decolonization. So that got me thinking more. And I actually went back and reread Frantz Fanon's book because of that. So that was a positive thing of that. You could always talk about anything, but in terms of acting and your line of march, needs to be based, in my opinion, on a good understanding of imperialism and the stepchildren of imperialism, or I should say the ancestors of imperialism, which is mercantile colonialism and chattel slavery, right? Because a lot of things we talk about with wanting to decolonize the town or decolonize a country that's already been settled and has a class stratified society like the United States. It's hard to talk about decolonization without understanding what colonization is and what it means and how profound that is in terms of the effects capitalism has on not just the classes, you know, the middle class, the working class, the capitalist class, but how it affects us as we react to that. right? Franz Fanon was dealing a lot with that in The Wretched of the Earth, but extensively more. The way it manifests in the United States, was one based on segregation, slavery, segregation, and racism. Segregation started in the 1860s, called Jim Crow. Good term to look up on Wikipedia. They have a decent entry on it. The issue of racism in the United States, and why, when we say there's black people, why there are black people beyond simply saying is a skin color. That there's a community. Some people argue that blacks are a nationality, and the same with Chicanos and other Latino groups and indigenous peoples. A lot of that is determined, and what they had to deal with the democratic revolutionaries of Africa, primarily the Nkrumah in Ghana, Nyeri in Tanzania, all who were honest. I call them revolutionary Democrats because they call themselves socialists, but they didn't fight for socialist revolution. What they fought for is just getting Britain and France and Portugal out of Africa. And to a large degree, that's what they accomplished, and it's to their credit that they were consistent in that fight. That was the first stage of decolonization, the actual physical removal of imperialist troops and occupation. And when I say occupation, I mean you're integrated into the metropolitan, your colonial oppressor's state. That was an extreme example with all the French colonies. If you were a Vietnamese person or you were Algerian, you were a citizen of France. And that's another interesting, fascinating discussion about citizenship. But ending that relationship was the key aspect of that. It's very hard to discuss also, why weren't there successful workers' revolutions and socialist revolutions in those countries? And that's a legacy of the failure of true decolonization, because you can't really decolonize unless you eliminate the political economy and politics of imperialism. That is capitalism. I'm using a very orthodox definition, Leninist definition of imperialism, where it's about the political domination of finance capital over everything. And if you don't eliminate that, you're always going to have the same problems. And this is one of the things we're confronted with in the United States. And then the thornier issues, like what does it mean to support indigenous rights? I don't think it's so clear-cut. And you have 340 million white people, and black people, and Latinos, and 15 million, 10 million indigenous people. How do you resolve that in a democratic manner? It's not an easy question. It's not unlike, though less serious, like reparations, which I sort of support in principle, but I have issues with it as you apply it. Like, especially since my grandparents came here in 1903 from a pogrom in Poland. We didn't actually create the settler state, but we benefited from it, right? So the issue is the United States still a settler nation? I tend to think it's not, but I think we have a huge legacy of settlerism that exists, and that's something we need to confront and discuss.
Okay, thanks, David. And now Shaun.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, mine's going to be like the other side of the coin to a lot of what you said. So thanks for the invitation. We're badly in need of these kinds of discussions, I think, especially today. Of course, the question isn't whether the left should be for or against decolonization. This is too abstract, especially because decolonization doesn't mean just one thing. I think this goes to your point. It means national liberation, anti-imperialism, land-back, curricular transformation, psychological liberation, epistemological critique, or sometimes almost nothing at all. Like so many liberal forms, it's so broad that it easily gets appropriated in the form of a brand, a slogan, a way for institutions to appear radical while changing very little. It can even provide the necessary appearance that allows brutality as usual to operate beneath a thin, shiny, decolonial veil. So then, what does it mean to decolonize? After the negation, after the criticism, after the D in decolonize, then what? Criticism, of course, is necessary. Racial rule, extraction, dispossession must be condemned. But condemnation, criticism, even rage aren't on their own politics. A serious left must ask what social forms should replace the ones that we negate. Freedom isn't produced merely by removing an oppressor. It's produced by building forms of life by which people's needs are collectively recognized and met. Take the classical meaning of decolonization, as we were just listening to. The removal of the colonial ruler. Of course, the left should support the overthrow of direct colonial domination, but there's a problem when decolonization appears simply as national liberation. Colonial domination produces the colonized subject as an abstraction. It gathers heterogeneous forms of life under a common regime of rule, administration, extraction, policing, the world market. The colonized are unified, but negatively. What they share isn't an emancipated form of life. They share a common structure of domination, but that domination is experienced differently by different parts of the population: workers, women, traditional authorities, migrants, and even emerging elites. Anti-colonial nationalism gives political form to this antagonism, but this can dangerously become a reified negative unity. The nation, this abstraction by which hundreds of millions of people are like next-door neighbors, then appears as the positive substance of the people, rather than as a political abstraction produced through colonial domination and anti-colonial struggle, a distortion to be overcome. The nation is inherited. It can't be the truth of freedom. Decolonization must entail the unwinding of colonial subjectivity itself. It must move beyond abstract national identity toward concrete forms of collective life, democratic institutions, relations to land, social reproduction, standards of justice rooted in people's needs. Otherwise, the flag changes, but private property, the police, the atomized subject, and even the young bourgeoisie take the reins. Lucky them. Through the post-colonial nation, the colonizer has colonized you behind your back. Hence, decolonization isn't socialism. But socialism can't bypass decolonization either. Socialism without decolonization is false universalism. Decolonization without socialism virtually ensures capture by capital, state power, and new elites. Something similar happens in land back. The issue is far too serious for us to not be clear and strategic about what we mean. Too often, land back appears as a shallow moral slogan, one that our corporate university could easily include in marketing materials with a brown fist in the air. Wow. In fact, land was really taken, but restitution is abstract if we imagine that the problem can be solved by transferring bourgeois property title from one subject to another. The deeper problem is the property form. Colonizers didn't only take land, they transformed land into title, asset, jurisdiction, an object of exclusive command. They made land into something that one could own, sell, speculate on, and even destroy, the right to use and abuse the conditions of collective survival. Land thus isn't an ordinary object, it's the condition of life: water, food, housing, ecology, and future generations. The scandal isn't only that land was stolen, it's that land was made into the kind of thing that could be entirely controlled by someone so that they could accumulate advantages and destroy others' means of survival. If land back means giving someone else the same abstract power of ownership, then it changes the owner of the abstraction without abolishing the abstraction. The aim can't be to give anyone, even in the name of restitution, total dominion over land as property. The aim has to be the transformation of land relations, stewardship, use, democratic management, and forms of social reproduction beyond capitalist property. This strengthens the claim by radicalizing it. Land back is serious when it means land beyond property. Land back, therefore, must be strategic, a struggle to build indigenous power and anti-capitalist coalitions capable of transforming property, ecology, housing, water, and collective life. The same issue appears in the call to decolonize the curriculum. The university isn't neutral. Its disciplines were shaped by empire, slavery, racial classification, state power, and class reproduction. The curriculum is a real political problem. However, we see a theme. There's an abstract and unserious version of curricular decolonization. To consider the curriculum in feckless moral terms, too many old white men, too many compromised authors, too much Western canon, is again to simply invert the colonial terms of domination and do nothing more than that. Too abstract, too unserious. A curriculum isn't a moral purity test. We must treat it as an apparatus for producing judgment. The fact that a thinker is morally or politically compromised doesn't on its own make them dispensable. Often the opposite is true. For one thing, we need to understand the concepts that shape our lives, those that organize our domination. So we need to understand those concepts more, not less. We don't read them because they're innocent, but because they created a world that we must overcome. Only academic aristocracy can afford the luxury of throwing away powerful thinkers because those thinkers are morally compromised. We must learn how to use dangerous tools without becoming ruled by them. Decolonizing the curriculum shouldn't mean purifying the canon for the sake of our own moral comfort. We need the intellectual means for understanding and transforming the world. We should expand the archive, recover suppressed traditions, read against imperial common sense, and build a curriculum adequate to capitalism, colonialism, race, gender, ecology, and social reproduction. That is, adequate to overcoming these things, right? Reducing politics to moral slogans ripe for academic marketing isn't helpful. The same question applies to psychological and epistemological decolonization. Replace it with what? No one thinks from nowhere. Language, culture, institutions, and shared categories precede us. Freedom can't mean escaping social formation. It must mean collectively transforming the forms that form us. The opposite of colonial formation isn't the absence of formation, it's emancipatory formation. This is the general point. Decolonization can't be merely negative. It can't only remove the colonizer, reverse the title, purge the syllabus, reject inherited thought, or express rage at injustice. Moral inversion isn't liberation. It's the old abstraction with the signs reversed. We don't need a politics of innocent purity. We need a politics by which we construct durable, sustainable, just practices and institutions. The question is how to become powerful enough, collectively, to transform what we inherited into forms of life governed by justice, care, truth, and real human need. We must defend the destruction of colonial and imperial domination, but we must also criticize every form of decolonization that stops at negation, symbolism, moral reversal, purity, property transfer, or nationalist reification. The real task begins after the D in decolonial, the construction of concrete social forms through which people live together freely, consciously, and justly.
Thank you. Okay, now we have David Lau.
Okay, so that's a lot. There's a lot in those talks. I guess my thought following that is that I would want to emphasize not decolonization, but this concept that Shaun referred to, anti-colonial nationalism, which historically was what Benedict Anderson called the last wave of classically modern national movements. So I would kind of want to back up and précis Anderson a little bit and say that basically out of this kind of early mercantile colonial world that was being described earlier by David, you got the kind of first wave of national movements that Benedict Anderson very famously describes in his book Imagined Communities, which I would highly recommend people make a study of. There's so much lazy Marxist mind kind of thinking out there about these categories and these topics, and Anderson's book is definitely an effort to combat lazy Marxism. And so what he does in a way in that book is he starts out by saying, we have to kind of reconceive of nationalism as an ambivalent structure, on the one hand related to kinship, which for Anderson was solidaristic and non-judgmental as a social form. And we also have to see it as coming out of these kind of great world religions where people could enter into a faith and they could become part of it. World religions were open to new practitioners. So nationalism for Anderson kind of comes out of world religion, comes out of the kinship structure, and its early expressions in the kind of first wave of his main examples are American, I mean that in the broadest sense of the Americas, forms of nationalism. The revolt in Peru, the Bolivarian wave of struggle in Latin America, the United States' his form of kind of revolutionary nationalism. And these were basically Republican forms of nationalism that then traveled back to Europe and gave to Europe a kind of new and modern form, relying principally on print capitalism to transmit and encode a kind of national consciousness through newspaper reading and novel reading. And you basically got these modernizing imperial regimes in Europe. These are distinct from the later kind of Leninist concepts of empire and whatnot, but and these were European regimes that attempted to kind of Russify themselves or nationalize themselves, modeled on this kind of modern American origin Creole nationalism of the 18th and early 19th century. Okay, so you have like early Republican nationalism, Creole nationalism, Creole origins of Republican American world nationalism. Then you have like official state European nationalism and empire. And then you have flowing out of that, this kind of last wave of nationalism, which I would refer to earlier as anti-colonial nationalism. And these were the classic struggles that have already been made reference to, like on the Gold Coast in Africa, or the Palestinian movement for national determination, combating the Zionist entity and whatnot. So anyway, so that's kind of how I would want to frame the concept. I find decolonization, as you encounter it in university discourse, Shaun's already getting into this, it's basically kind of semi-coherent a lot of the time. To me, it is very much part of the Marxist tradition, this topic of decolonization. And if you look at some of the classic renderings of it, like in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's famous essay, which again I would recommend everyone reading, Decolonizing the Mind. People read that? Okay, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's essay. That basically is just like an orthodox Marxist account of like what happened in Kenya, or what East Africa, what became Kenya. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o is calling for like a further attempt to kind of uproot, the colonial mindset that's been implanted in people. And if you look at kind of British imperial policy in East Africa and elsewhere, basically there was a primary importance put on language education and literary education. So in order to advance as a colonial subject in the educational system in East Africa or in India or in the Caribbean and on, you basically had to be very, very good in English. And English kind of counted as a subject more so than other subjects. And so what they did was they trained a kind of colonial subject elite that had an implanted European consciousness in it. And thus they saw the world, as it were, these black Africans saw the world through kind of European spiritual eyeglasses, to use Ngugi wa Thiong'o's famous expression. So I do think there are some accounts of the term that are interesting, that are familiar to me, that do have like some coherence and consistency to them, but a lot of it is just kind of a jargon today. Obviously, though, we could say, like this was being brought up, your initial remark, it's hard to dismiss it as a concept, or to like theoretically debunk it, when what we see happening around the world, and the world changing so much before our eyes, as a product of a kind of late and still existing anti-colonial national movement, i.e. the Palestinian national liberation struggle. And also we can see in the Iranian kind of story of the post-revolutionary phase, another kind of late national self-determination struggle. And you could say that if we're going to speak about things being colonized today, I think that these terms like the neo-colonial regime of the International Monetary Fund and the United States, okay, that's like a way to kind of think about how these terms might come to life again. Or if we thought about like the US bases that are all over Latin America, right? Why is it that the United States can just like drop into Latin America and like abduct leaders? It's not just Maduro, but Zelaya in 2009, for example, in Honduras. So why is it the United States can just do? Why can it just sort of threaten Gustavo Petro with a similar action? It's because it's got colonies, i.e. military bases, all around the planet. And if we look at the basic thing that's happening in Iran today, it's that the United States just had like 12 or 15 bases, it's not totally clear, 12 or 15 colonies in the GCC countries wiped out. And the United States is never, ever going to be able to reconstruct those colonial military bases in those GCC countries. And it's a huge historic defeat for the United States that it's facing right now, and it's unable to really accept. So again, I think that these terms, as much as I've sometimes been a little bit like hesitant around them, and I don't like all the kind of literary theory jargon of post-colonial studies and decoloniality, that I sent Kevin an essay by Neil Larson called The Jargon of Decoloniality. Neil Larson is an emeritus professor and comp lit at UC Davis and a good Marxist Latin American literature scholar. And he just wrote a devastating takedown of kind of decolonial theory talk for Catalyst Journal.
It's 30 seconds to wrap up.
Yeah, so I hope I'm being somewhat coherent, but I would again want to put more emphasis on this kind of what I think of as a more accurate historical concept of anti-colonial nationalism. It's fundamentally Republican character, rooted in language, rooted in republicanism. And like Anderson, I would want to, in some ways, distinguish that kind of anti-colonial nationalism's patriotism as a positive, something of a positive, and want to kind of push back against some lazy Marxist thinking in the way that Anderson once did long ago.
Okay, thank you, David. And now Richard.
Okay, I'm not really going to be able to confine this to 8 minutes, but I'll do my best. Can you hear me?
Yeah, well, we can hear you, I think. Huh? Okay.
Okay, the topic I'm supposed to address today is decolonization. I shall understand the word in what is now a fairly old-fashioned literal sense. Thus, I shall exclude, for example, demands for, quote, decolonizing the curriculum, unquote, and other expanded and metaphorical uses of the term. Although both colonization and a related but separate concept of imperialism have a long history going back thousands of years, I shall not be addressing the pre-modern examples of empire and colonization. The history of humanity for thousands of years is summarized by the Latin adage, homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. I consider that a slander against wolves. Slavery, conquest, and exploitation long predated capitalism and were not invented by Europeans. It seems wrong to me, though, to describe this long history of cruelty as inhumanity. On the contrary, our inhumanity, the extraordinary capacity of human beings to exploit and dominate our fellow human beings, is central to the story of how we have gained such control over nature and are a unique species on this planet. But in the last few hundred years, capitalism has fundamentally changed the character of this domination of other human beings. And while in one respect perfecting this domination, it has also raised the possibility of its abolition. Empires have existed for thousands of years, but I will take it for granted that the British Empire, for example, was a fundamentally different type of entity from the Assyrian Empire, the Roman Empire, or the Caliphate. They are all gone, but what is gone and what has been left behind is not the same. The question of decolonization, in the sense that I am addressing it, is thus a specifically modern question that is premised on the conquest of the planet by capitalism. One could begin somewhat earlier. Thus, the American Revolution could be seen as an early successful experience of decolonization, as could in different ways also the Haitian Revolution and the establishment of independent states in Latin America. Although these are more pertinent to my theme than pre-modern examples because they are the product of bourgeois societies, I will nevertheless focus on mid-20th century developments because these seem to me what people usually mean when they refer to decolonization, and because it is the mid-20th century that forms the basis for the world we live in today. For most of the history of civilization, which is to say class society, the idea that the inhabitants of the northwestern edge of the Eurasia-Africa global island would achieve a position of global hegemony would have seemed quite improbable. Starting from a position of relative economic and cultural backwardness with regards to other global civilizations, however, Europeans began to catch up in the late Middle Ages. The concept of the Middle Ages is, of course, a Eurocentric one and difficult to apply convincingly to other global civilizations. But an age in naval and military technology meant that starting in the 15th century and continuing through to the 18th century, Europe had managed to become the center of globalized networks of trade. This in turn triggered profound internal changes in the more advanced European societies. From the late 16th through the late 18th centuries, several bourgeois revolutions changed the internal class political dynamics of the more advanced European states. And thus, over the course of a millennium, Europe, or rather a part of it, went from being a set of poor societies with extremely weak, almost non-existent state structures, feudalism, to being the most technologically advanced and wealthiest societies on the planet, with the most powerful states. Nevertheless, despite European preponderance, significant parts of the planet remained outside of direct European control. Even as late as the French Revolution, the coming of European global hegemony might have seemed unlikely to intelligent observers. China, the largest state on the planet, did not feel threatened by Europeans in the 18th century and was in fact itself an expansionist power. Europeans had been interacting for centuries with Africans, most notoriously through the slave trade, but this depended on African collaborators. However, their direct political control only existed in a few of the coastal fringes of a vast continent. This seemed unlikely to change. The almost complete conquest of the planet occurred quite late, really just in time for World War I, that marked the beginning of the great European Civil War of 1914 to 1945, which would spell the end of European supremacy. Two additional observations are necessary. The first is that when I say Europe, it is necessary to include three other powers, two of which were geographically extra-European, the United States and Japan, and one only partly European power, Russia. Japan was, of course, the great exception, a completely non-European power that, despite not being part of the European cultural oikoumene, and at the other end of Eurasia, developed as a capitalist and imperialist power, essentially the same way as the other great powers. The lesson here being that race and culture are fundamentally secondary to capitalism and economics. What enabled Japan to not only avoid domination and conquest by Europe, but to even join the exclusive club of the dominators is a complex question, but would seem to be related to the striking parallels between its pre-modern development and that of Europe. It seems that feudalism in some way enabled the development of capitalism, just as Marxists have always hoped that the development of capitalism will enable socialism. The second point that I would like to stress is that although I'm emphasizing the dynamism of European societies, one should not envision this rise of European power as taking place against the backdrop of a static non-European world that lived in a timeless continuity, only waiting to be plundered, conquered, or as the Europeans often imagined, civilized, quote, unquote. What I shall focus on now, though, is not the process that led to the conquest of the planet, but rather its aftermath. Direct European control only lasted 2 or 3 generations in most cases. In the aftermath of the Second World War, decolonization proceeded with striking rapidity. It was, of course, pushed by movements for decolonization, but except in a few cases, which attracted a great deal of attention at the time, decolonization was not so strongly resisted by the colonial powers. The exceptions like Algeria and Vietnam naturally were what was most noticed and led the new left to exaggerate the radicalism and disruptiveness to capitalism of the process. Instead of causing profound economic dislocation to the colonizer, the period of decolonization was associated with an economic upswing of capitalism, and labor shortages even led to the migration of people from former colonies to the former metropoles. While this has undoubtedly had significant cultural effects on the former colonial powers, it undermines the idea that without colonialism, the economy of the colonizers would collapse. 50 or 60 years ago, leftists looking at the process of decolonization often imagined that it was the beginning of a revolutionary process. In hindsight, from the 21st century, I would suggest a different interpretation. The impulse behind decolonization was fundamentally a liberal one. This is not a critique. Liberal demands for democracy and self-determination or against racial discrimination are eminently supportable in themselves. Insofar as it is understood as a liberal demand, decolonization must be judged both a success and a failure. It was a success in that formal colonial empires have vanished, and overwhelmingly, the formal colonies have become independent. It was, however, a failure in two respects. Just as overwhelmingly the former colonies have now become independent, they have also remained poorer than their former colonizers. Secondly, again, with some exceptions, liberal political institutions are far weaker or non-existent in the former colonies than in the colonizers. So the concept of the Third World, which was originally a neutral Cold War term, emphasizing a desire for political neutrality between East and West, now frequently has pejorative connotations of poverty, corruption, and dictatorship. But this concept is itself a product of decolonization. One early response to this was the theory of neocolonialism. The argument was made that mere formal independence was insufficient or perhaps even irrelevant, and that true decolonization required a social revolution in the former colonies. At a time when Marxism, or a less specific socialism, seemed popular in many former colonies, and often had leftist sympathizers in the former colonial powers, this idea had a certain plausibility. Furthermore, the undeniable weakness of bourgeois social forms, the distorted characteristics of capitalist development, and many other problems could in many cases be correctly ascribed to colonial rule. The result was a series of nationalist regimes that in most cases pursued developmentalist projects. In this respect, the Arab socialism of Nasser bore a greater resemblance to its sworn enemy, the socialist Zionism of Ben-Gurion, than either did to the USSR or China. But in some cases, these regimes rejected capitalist property relations entirely and produced third world Stalinist regimes. Along the way, imperialism, in its modern Leninist sense, however, changed character too. Whereas the Leninist model of imperialism had presumed the world of competing imperialist powers, the imperialism of the post-1945 world represented a single hegemonic bloc of the West, including Japan, led by the United States. No longer could imperialism be understood as a mad scramble by a handful of powers to divide up the planet, but instead, as understood by the theory of neocolonialism, it appeared now rather the attempt by the wealthy capitalist world to maintain economic hegemony without any longer needing direct political rule over the poorer majority. If a Leninist theory of imperialism seemed to quite accurately describe the world of the first half of the 20th century, a Kautskian theory of ultra-imperialism seemed to better describe the world of the late 20th century. Since the mid-20th century and the heyday of Afro-Asian Latin American solidarity, it has furthermore become clear that the fate of different parts of the third world is divergent. Singapore is not Indonesia. Ghana is not Sudan. The BRICS are an increasingly important part of the global economy. Industrialization is certainly no longer confined to what Lenin described as the imperialist countries. I must at this point introduce an important conceptual distinction, that between settler colonialism and imperialism. The classic Leninist theory of imperialism was formulated to respond to the transformation of global capitalism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Clearly, however, European expansionism did not begin then. The United States is a product of settler colonialism, but not of imperialism in the Leninist sense. If it subsequently became imperialist in the Leninist sense, then that is a later development. Most of the great imperialist powers, such as Britain and France, were not themselves products of settler colonialism, as the United States is, and some countries, Argentina, for example, that are themselves the products of settler colonialism, can also, insofar as one adopts the language of neocolonialism, be described as victims of imperialism. For the most part, the great age of settler colonialism preceded that of imperialism, and unlike the project of direct European political control, its consequences seem in most cases to have been irreversible. Again, there are exceptions, such as Algeria. While settler colonialism and imperialism in its Leninist form were in general separate, there are cases of overlap. One case of overlap is, of course, Palestine. No doubt the reason why Palestine is a cause célèbre throughout the world is that Palestinians suffer under direct colonial rule in a world where this seems wildly outdated. There are several peculiarities about the situation. One is that the settlers did not come from the imperial power. There is, in fact, no homeland for them to return to. The relationship between Britain and the Zionists was always transactional and never organic. Each was prepared to turn on the other. In the end, it was the United States and not Britain that Israel turned to as a sponsor and ally. A second peculiarity about Zionism, indeed its greatest peculiarity, was its dual character as settler colonialism and as the national liberation movement of an oppressed people. To the Palestinians, it was the former, settler colonialism, and to the Jews, the latter, national liberation. In this respect, it was unique. And it also manifests a very great degree of ideological autonomy that separates it from any immediate material interest or the logic of capital. It is hard to see how the devastation of Gaza, leaving aside bizarre Trumpian fantasies of Atlantic City on the Mediterranean, or the settlements on the West Bank, served the logic of either global or local Israeli capitalism. To pose, however, the liberation of Palestine exposes very clearly the limits of a discourse of decolonization. Essentially, there are three approaches, all problematic. We might, by analogy, call them the Irish, the Algerian, and the South African. The default international position is a repartition of Mandate Palestine along the lines of the 1949 ceasefire lines. That is to say, a Palestinian state in at best about 23% of Mandate Palestine. The second is an Arab state from the river to the sea. This faces the awkward question of the millions of Israeli Jews. Either what is envisioned is at best a Nakba in reverse, or worse, a second Holocaust, or in some Islamist versions, a return of the Jews now living in historic Palestine to a traditional subordinate dhimmi status. The third is a binational state. This is popular among liberals precisely because it is based on liberal ideals. Each version has obvious problems. The two-state solution seemed plausible for a brief period in the 1990s, but it is now widely viewed with skepticism and hostility, not only by the Zionist right and the Palestinian left, but even by many Zionist and Palestinian nationalists and others who had previously supported it. Why this is the case is a complicated question that I will not attempt to address now. But what I think needs to be pointed out is that even in the increasingly unlikely circumstances that such a solution were implemented and a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza at peace with an Israeli state in its pre-1967 borders came into existence, that the relationship between such a state and Israel would be a textbook example of the economic dependence of the former on the latter, i.e. neocolonialism. As for the second model, leaving aside moral objections to ethnic cleansing, genocide, or the suppression of people based on religion or ethnicity, it clearly cannot be implemented against an Israel that is the strongest state in the region and possesses hundreds of nuclear weapons. Finally, the last option, the one-state solution, is advocated by many people because they think it desirable. One may say it shows the contradiction of liberalism. It is undoubtedly a democratic solution, but one that has extremely limited support among precisely the people who would be the citizens of that state. And thus its democratic character remains hopelessly abstract and unrealizable. Realizable. The reason that this solution, quote unquote, has a certain currency is the analogy with South Africa, where the peaceful democratic overcoming of apartheid and its replacement by a seemingly normal non-racist capitalism occurred. If this was possible in South Africa, why, people wonder, is it not possible in Israel-Palestine? In addition to ideological aspects, there are two fundamental material reasons. The demographic ratio of Jews to Arabs in Israel-Palestine is quite different from that of whites to non-whites in South Africa. But even more fundamentally, Israeli capitalism has never depended on Arab labor except marginally. Zionism imported a working class to Palestine. The whole subject of imperialism and settler colonialism is fraught with moralism, guilt, defensiveness, and self-righteousness. These emotional responses certainly often obscure clear thinking, but they are themselves also a testament to the current hegemony of a fundamentally liberal notion of international relations. Ideally, many people would say that the world should consist of a series of democratic states that act to benefit their citizens' interests, respect human rights, and interact with each other according to the principles of international law. To object that this neither describes the world as it is, nor as it ever has been, is to miss the interesting point that this is an ideal in which many people believe and which most people pay lip service to, which is a tribute to what one might describe as the ideological Europeanization, or one might better say, embourgeoisement of the world. Thus, paradoxically, even as decolonization shrank Europe's political role, the ideas of national self-determination, democracy, socialism, etc., that motivated it were imported European ideas. By European ideas, I mean, of course, modern bourgeois European ideas, and not ideas that Europeans of a few centuries ago would have recognized as theirs. Furthermore, the post-colonial states also inherited the colonial states' instruments of government and institutions, which means, of course, instruments of class domination also. One might say that we, meaning humanity in general, are all trying to work out the unfinished task begun by 19th century European liberalism. We, whoever we are, or on whatever continent we live, or whatever our economic circumstances, gender, or the color of our skin, are tasked with this problem.
Can we wrap it up, Richard, please?
Yes, I'm almost done. That this seems a peculiar and wholly counterintuitive understanding of the 21st century is, I would argue, due to two factors. The first is the crisis of liberalism, and the second is the crisis of Marxism, which recognized the first crisis and was meant to overcome it, but itself fell into crisis. Amidst this dual failure, a tendency exists to invoke a rhetorical strategy that appeals to liberal principles which appear universal and self-evident, but are divorced from the historical problem of liberalism, and also bypasses the question of Marxism and what the meaning of attempts to abolish capitalism in the 20th century was. As a rhetorical strategy, decolonization in the 21st century, as opposed to decolonization in the mid-20th century, therefore seems to me that a rhetorical strategy that obscures more than it reveals about the world we live in. A world which is, however, in large part a result of that earlier, more directly political meaning of decolonization.
Okay,
Sorry
thank you.
That was at least 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, sorry.
Well, let's have a round of applause for all of our panelists, please. And I would like to just pose a topic for the Q&A, and that is the most formative political experience for our Generation Z, which was the college Palestine encampments, and then also a secondary one, which was the BLM protests. So those were the two actually concrete, I think, social movements that Gen Z experienced. The BLM protests had, some sort of sense of decolonialism with them, but the Palestine protests really were the ones where the term, I think, became more palpable to our generation. And there's a particular thing about the Palestine protests that I want to pose to the panelists, which is that at UC Santa Cruz, the goal was to get the UC to divest from large multinational companies to divest the endowment from weapons manufacturers, right? And I feel like what happened was very quickly, the students organizing the encampment ran up against this fact that, capitalism is this global system where if you are sitting on a lot of cash, you're going to invest it in a profitable industry, and the profitable industries include weapons manufacturers. So it very quickly ran up against this global problem. And then also the fact that being able to intervene in this basically extremely difficult disaster in the Middle East was very hard to do at the level of being a college student. Now, on the flip side, the encampments, when they were going on, they were the most sense I ever got of the student body exercising its will about anything, and exercising its will about what they wanted their university to do, how they wanted their tuition dollars to get spent, what it meant to think about how to spend the endowment.
Well, we need a round of responses for the panelists to respond to each other. Then you can ask a question with the privilege as the moderator.
Okay, well, I'm just going to type this up. And so I just wanted to open that to bring us into the present day in a matter of how the left is actually thinking about what it needs to organize globally against this problem of global capitalism, and if the history of decolonization is able to serve to think through those kind of problems, if the end is rendering aid to some people in a different country or exercising your democratic right to withdraw investment from a weapons industry that's abetting that. So, but anyways, I'd like to now offer the panelists a chance to respond to each other.
I'll talk about this a little bit since I was there. So, okay, has anyone read Decolonization is Not a Metaphor? Cool.
No.
Everyone's homework today is to do that. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. In that case, I'm just going to read a little bit of it. Decolonization as a metaphor allows people to equivocate these contradictory decolonial desires because it turns decolonization into an empty signifier to be filled by any track towards liberation. In reality, the track walks all over land/people in settler context. Though the details are not fixed or agreed upon, in our view, decolonization in the settler context must involve the repatriation of land simultaneous to the recognition of how land and relations to land have already been differently understood and enacted, that is, all of land, not just symbolically. This is precisely why decolonization is necessarily unsettling, especially across lines of solidarity. Decolonization never takes place unnoticed. That's a quote from Fanon. Settler colonialism and its decolonization implicates and unsettles everyone. And to that, I just bring that up to say that, like, Palestine was very much and is very much a local issue. I think it's like, in part because of how much we have invested in Israel. We are literally doing the research, building and funding the weapons being sent to slaughter Palestinians. What I saw after October 2023 was like the most, everyone was unsettled. It felt uncomfortable to go to school here, to be on campus, and it felt sickening. And divestment specifically is a local issue as well, because my boss told me, I used to work at PERC, she's part of the Ask Me union, who represents custodial workers, and she told me that she's pissed off because her retirement fund is invested in genocide. She doesn't have a say. So this is very much a local issue, a labor issue, and a student issue, because we are treated as consumers of this university, but we make it up. We can withhold our labor too. It's harder to organize as students because the turnover and all that stuff, but the encampment was a strike, a student strike. We withheld our labor for 30 days, and I guess, yeah, we ran into this global challenge, but it was more like we learned that decision-making power is concentrated in the hands of the UC regents, who are evil overlords who run this university, and it includes Gavin Newsom. So you can't just negotiate with Cynthia in a room to get things done, apparently. You can't protest. You can't occupy the quarry. I get, we've been told all of these ways are, I don't know, but so we learned that you have to go through the UC regents, and the UC regents, it's true that they only care about money and the capitalist profit incentive. However, there is room for, or I guess my participation in the encampment kind of led me to question my role in the university, whether or not I should drop out, and why I'm here. Because why am I funding a genocide to go here? Is that worth it? And it kind of led me to thinking about okay, well, what is the role of anyone in an institution that wants to do good? Because I was thinking about as I'm graduating, what's next for me? I kind of want to be a lawyer now, but I was how can I live with myself if that is becoming institutionalized? What does a future for me mean when I'm what does my future look like when the world that I'm about to enter into is funneling all of our money towards the top and towards genocide? And so I was really looking at this question of how within institutions, within institutions, the way that you practice, like put theory into praxis, I guess, into practice is through extending the revolutionary solidarity you have to comrades who are being criminalized, the way that you engage in like class relations out on the streets and putting that into the institutions and into the classrooms. Like, I feel like I'm kind of here because I'm like, yeah, let me shake things up a little bit. I think I have a different perspective than everybody here, and I feel like diversifying our perspectives and strategies and forms of protest is like, that's what we need. We need intertribal organizing, like local indigenous solidarity movements, local land back movements, like reclaiming the university, occupying a classroom, etc. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Elio. Did you have something to say to that, Shaun?
Not directly in response to that, but
Yeah, or just in general. Yeah.
in response to the panel as a whole, because I think there's a little bit of disagreement on the panel, and so I thought I would pick up on some of what Richard was saying about democracy and nationalism and the kinds of contradictions that we see, and I think in some ways that relates closely to some of the things that I was trying to say. So I'm going to get a little bit in the weeds, but I hope that it'll make sense why I'm doing so. So in certain points in Capital and in other places, Marx points out that capitalism can only work because you have, he gives one example being like the separation of producers, where they only communicate through exchange. In other words, like they can't sort of coordinate what it is that they're doing according to concrete, rational, needs-based sort of calculus or something like this, right? Similarly, he talks about how capitalism can only function because the separation of production from consumption means something similar. Like we can't democratically sort of determine what it is that we're producing and why we're doing so. Again, those decisions are only mediated kind of like through exchange and things like this. So this leads for Marx to him using sort of metaphors like how vision works, for instance. He says that the way that we understand how we view things is as though objects impress themselves on our ability to see things without fully accounting for the fact that our eye actually participates, right? So his point is that we encounter a world where objects appear to us to have the subjectivity that we lack, and therefore we're sort of made to go along with the forms of social life that the world sort of imposes onto us, right? My point in bringing this up is that I would argue that the nation form is precisely such, a form by which these kinds of illusions and fantasies and contradictions are able to realize themselves. So if the nation form is something like, an ethnicity, a tribe, a community, even, well, then the fact that it doesn't seem to have any necessary content, that it's just, we wave a flag, we have monuments, we have certain holidays, and so on and so forth, is nonetheless a way that we become invested in the state, and that underwrites the capitalist processes by which our very sort of like devotion to the nation is like allows for the state and for capital to abuse us, oppress us, exploit us in various ways. And so I think it's important to recognize like how the form of the nation arises with capitalism and what its function is in the reproduction of capital.
Would the other panelists like to respond to the panel?
Yeah, probably to your last comments. I agree with your very last comments, but I think you're, with all respect and love, I think if you're focused on about me, that is, what can I do to do? I think you're looking at it a little bit myopically, and we all do this because we're human beings and it's part of our species development. But it's what you. But your actual last comments are in contradiction to what you said, because the comments about, I don't feel like participating in this. The fact is, we live in the United States. I have my money at a bank. The bank probably invests who knows where. It's always exchanging. I shop at Safeway. Safeway has products that whose companies and parent companies probably invest in Israel, for example, or in the military, which is a bigger thing in the United States than investing in Israel. The reason I support BDS, and not all socialists do, by the way, is that I recognize the contradiction. Divestment means nothing to Israel economically, because a university like UC divest $100 million in companies doing business like Intel in South Africa, Freudian slip, in Israel, they sell it and somebody else buys it, and the investment's still there. The ownership is still there. It's just not by the university, and it's a little bit of a kind of like a liberal feel-good thing to do that. I think from a personal point of view. But on the other hand, it's the single biggest political blow you can make to Israel is when public institutions announce they're going to divest from companies doing business in Israel. I think that's phenomenal. That's why I support it. Okay, that's the reason I support BDS. It's been up until the Gaza.
You support it because of its propaganda value.
Yes, it's propaganda value, not political in the more narrow sense of the word, but I mean in the propaganda value. Richard's right. And it's the best propaganda. It's the only propaganda value that went across international lines when it came to Palestine prior to Gaza, prior to the Al-Aqsa uprising. And Israel's devoting $100 million a year before Gaza to fight that on campuses through AIPAC and through these Zionist political clubs that don't call them that. And so there's a lot of reasons to support something like that beyond you think it's actually going to have an effect on Israel. It does, but it doesn't have an effect that we all think it does sometimes. It's just that it hurts Israel. They know it. I have Israeli cousins. I have like 20 Israeli cousins. And they're liberal Israelis. And they marched against Netanyahu. But they're up in arms about what's going on in American campuses since Gaza and before Gaza. Because the tide is so shifted between... I'm sure Richard has a similar experience. My parents were very pro-Zionist. And so breaking from that took me, when I was 13, to go to a trip to Israel and seeing racism up front. And being shelled by the PLO from Jordan. And so it was before Black September in 1970. It was 1971. And so when you see how things have changed, I think it's for a positive thing. But that's kind of like at that level of Palestine. I don't know what it has to do with decolonization per se. So like Richard, I don't use that term in any particular context that I can think of, except in discussions like this with other people on the socialist left. It's another thing, I don't use the term left, I use the socialist left because fucking Democrats, pardon my French, have tried to own the term left, and it's annoying. And so, I think all three of you guys over here on this side, I think you stuck to some very, very good historical commentary about development of what I call imperialism and how imperialism deconstructs itself after decolonialism and then reconstructs itself, reforms itself. Politically, it continued dominating. I think both of you had that as part of the thesis that you were putting out. And I don't really have anything to disagree with it, even as a kind of like I like to call myself an Orthodox Leninist on all these things. Nothing is in contradiction. But I think the point one of you made about...
yourself an Orthodox Leninist, so do you think that Lenin's theory, as outlined in imperialism, describes the world today?
I think everything in there does, minus what you pointed out about
I just thought we had a format where we were all going to respond
Yeah.
before there
Okay,
were
sure.
questions.
That's
or
fine.
Yeah, so
whatever. You already
let's-
spoke
okay,
for
I'll
20
stop
some
and we
minutes
can-
or whatever,
David,
yeah.
let's...
Good
would
question.
you like
No,
to
it's all
say a
good.
piece?
It's
Yeah.
just a format that was
Yeah, go ahead,
laid
Dave.
out, so, 20 minutes of, I thought, sometimes questionable ideas. Of course, we couldn't be Orthodox Leninists or something like that today because we don't live in a world that is described exactly in imperialism. Historically, that's been superseded, but Lenin is full of all kinds of interesting and intricate insights that are often completely overlooked unless you've accurately reconstructed the whole of the text. I think that we have to remember something about Marx in this kind of context, which is that Marx basically saw capitalism as developing a transnational dynamic of the forces of production. And he saw that very early on, and we could say that as capitalism has continued to grow, we've continued to see an ever deepening dynamic of this kind of transnational dimension of the development of the forces of production. And we're really getting a flavor for that today as we experience the fallout of this gigantic calamity in Iran, closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the calamity of the defeat of the United States in the trade war with China. You can see the inability of the United States actually to separate itself from the Chinese productive base there. And I think basically Marx was pointing that out on the one hand, and though it's not typically a thing that communists and socialists have emphasized, he was also talking about the deep embeddedness of capitalism in particular nation states, particular legal, political histories, particular ethnic, linguistic subjectivities. And they were very much aware of the difficulties of revolution as it would have to transpire necessarily in particular national contexts. And famously, Marx and Engels, Marx's general, and in a lot of ways someone who was very much on his equal, if not his better, in terms of thinking about some of these war dynamics, they were very much aware that there had to be a kind of like series of revolutionary breakthroughs across the continent, and then they saw a wave of failures of this in 1848, and they saw another wave of it in the 1870s, and they ultimately kind of came up against the failures of these kinds of 19th century revolutionary dynamics. So the question about the nation and of nationalism today, we would be, I'm just going to fast forward to the present and think about the recent period, but we would have to point out that the period of global capitalism in which an expanding transnational group of productive forces, more or less along somewhat peaceful lines, is coming to an end. Increasingly, we see the strength of China, again, a legacy of its anti-colonial national movement. It's a legacy of its anti-colonial national movement and the success and the breakthrough of it, and the long imposed, the long extended imposition of sanctions on it. It's difficult period after the People's Republic's founding, the way it was forced onto its own track and had to develop its own military and had to develop its own currency, and is the only example in the world of a successful import substitution industrialization project, one that's been able to break out from the West, at least in part.
I'm sorry, what country are you talking about?
China.
Oh, China.
China. So I think that when we talk about some of these issues, we have to think about how capitalism is embedded within a national system, an interstate system, as it were. In Marxism, we don't really have a good theoretical elaboration in a simple short pamphlet like our tradition likes on the interstate system. We have maybe at best Perry Anderson's very elaborate commentaries on the history of individual nations. Now, I personally find it to be somewhat difficult to describe Israel as the national liberation project of the Jewish people. And I think that that's a highly ideological conception of the history of Zionism and of what Israel is represented. And I myself get my history of early Israel from Lenny Brenner and Zionism in Asia, the Dictators, which is, again, a text I would highly recommend to students and to others. Maybe some of us know this on the...
And the Iron Wall.
Yeah, and the Iron Wall. Yeah. Israel, it's not to say it doesn't have a left. Today it doesn't have a left, or it did have a left at one time. But I think that's a very narrow and ideological understanding of the history of Israel that Richard brought up. I think if we were going to talk about Israel today, we would have to emphasize not just these kind of like schematic things about its politics or like what people imagine the solutions. Israel today is greater Israel. It's an aggressive military form of society that is seeking to dominate all of its neighbors through direct intervention and the confiscation of land, territory, water. We talk about these things like these colonial issues. This is neocolonialism for sure. They are on the march across the Litani River. They control parts of southern Syria. They have already talked about how Turkey is next, and they have a consistent bombing policy in Iran. So we can't just think like, okay, there's these problems with like the solutions to the Zionist question or the Israel-Palestine. We're way past that. We're way past that situation. We're in a situation where this thing is completely out of control, and there's just on a daily basis almost a widening hurricane of colonial terror bombing. Okay?
Why call it neocolonial as opposed to fascist?
Well, there are, as it were, kind of openly fascist parties in Israel. I mean, I find the term fascism to be, again, like one of these terms, decolonization, that just gets tossed around a lot today. I mean, I think that historically fascism was basically defeated. I wouldn't myself describe like the right-wing dictatorships in Latin America in the 70s as like fascist dictatorships, though I know people do describe them that way. I'm of the view that fascism was like a competing idea and ideology and like program of modernity that failed, that came to grief in war in the Soviet Union and in Europe, and has not been able to reconstitute itself thereafter. Yeah, so I think I just find that for me, when the term gets introduced, sometimes like the way decolonization gets introduced, it's just like confusing, and it kind of doesn't allow us to really understand what historically is going on.
Can I follow up?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Well, I mean, I take the point that, I mean...
So just briefly, so we can move to Q&A.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I agree that, I mean, even scholars in fascism studies don't even have an agreed on definition of fascism. Nonetheless, it still seems to me that a kind of racial social order that's highly capitalist and that is itself imperialist, you know, on some of the same grounds, the same sort of like Lebensraum kind of like justification and so on and so forth, with a sort of like dictatorial leader. While I take your point that like, you know, definitions on fascism are pretty hazy, if not contradictory, I also would point out that I think we lose something if we can't see how the particularities of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany are reappearing today, and of course, different forms.
Let me clarify what I was saying. Okay, so what I would say about fascism is that it is basically a product of the interwar period, and in the sense that it was a response to revolution. And so it was it used to be called the Bolshevization of the European bourgeoisie. And so they had previously resorted to all kinds of counter-revolutionary violence. But what explains the scale of it after 1917 is the existence of this, as it were, socialist citadel in the East. And as Carl Schmitt famously said, we all live under the eye of the Russians. You know, it's kind of famous fascist theorists, and you know, I don't even want to label them too much. So that's I would say like you have to have a strong revolutionary left in the classical sense of the workers' movement in order to have a fascist reaction against it. And again, the kind of the descriptions.
This is Dylan Riley's argument.
Gopal Balakrishnan as well, a former comrade of his at the New Left Review. Yeah.
Yes, you may respond, and then we'll move to Q&A.
Okay, so my point about Zionism was the peculiarity of Zionism as a form of settler colonialism, that it's essentially ideologically motivated. What was the self-conscious ideological motivation of Zionism? The Zionists themselves saw themselves engaged in the national liberation of the Jewish people. That one rejects that vision, that one points out its inherently oppressive character to the Palestinians, doesn't deny that psychological fact. What I'm more struck by is not the psychological fact, but that essentially non-economic motivation for settler colonialism is quite different from normal settler colonialism, which is generally economically motivated. I mean, there are some exceptions, it's a little bit complicated, but in that sense, Zionism has several unique features sociologically understood. I'm trying to be analytic here. Okay, so I don't think my comment was some sort of ideological obfuscation. As for fascism, I think fascism is a widely misunderstood term. Not only would I not consider Israel fascist, it's Netanyahu, whatever crimes you want to ascribe to the Israeli state, he's a democratically elected parliamentary leader, as is Donald Trump.
As was
We do
Hitler.
not live in a fascist state. I think that the invocation of fascism vis-a-vis Trump is basically a scare tactic to get people to vote for the Democratic Party.
Exactly, yeah.
That's really all that it means. It's not a useful analysis. I don't think, by the way, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which I detest, is fascist either. Fascism describes a particular form of right-wing politics. Not all forms of right-wing dictatorship are fascist. Not all forms of right-wing politics, many of which commit great crimes and practice racism, are fascist. I think that we need to be precise in our analysis. And I don't think we should just throw around terms like fascism or decolonization or imperialism. We have to think about the underlying material, but also when we think about the underlying material character, we have to think about the problem of ideological autonomy.
Okay.
I agree that we need to be precise in our terms, and I would say that Israel is precisely fascist.
All right, great. On that note, let's move to...
Is Netanyahu based on the crushing of the Israeli working class? No. What you're calling fascism is the crushing of the Palestinians. Was U.S. policy in Iran in Vietnam fascist?
We could argue about how to precisely define
But
fascism.
I would just, maybe we could,
Johnson was committing genocide.
maybe
in
we could
Vietnam.
just think
But
about discussing.
You don't mean that Johnson really was a fascist.
I'm simply pointing out that
I think anatomy,
if someone says that Israel is fascist, that doesn't mean that they don't have a definition of fascism. To say that someone's just calling Israel fascist doesn't mean that they're just throwing around the term as you said.
I think.
But what you're basically using fascism as a term, what in German is called a Schimpfwort, a curse word, a term.
No, that's not correct. You're just assuming that. You're just saying that I'm doing that.
Well, we're not going to unpack the history of fascism today, so let's move on to a question from the audience. Yeah, and we can weave it into our responses, but I don't think
It says a
we
lot
need to
that
relitigate academia.
it says a lot that it's come back
Yeah.
and it's in people's head, and it says a lot about the nature of the strength of right-wing politics today. I think so. There's something in the political unconscious, Jameson's category, where this term has currency, like decolonization. It's speaking to us in ways, even if I don't necessarily always agree with how it's being used. Anyway.
Okay.
Very
Questions?
diplomatic, thank you.
I'd agree with you on that.
I'm
Alex?
trying to be diplomatic,
Yeah.
I guess that's a very consistent thought I've had, especially as somebody that kind of comes from a decolonial perspective, but like not necessarily like a Marxist history. I guess I previously called myself like an anarchist, and I was in a lot of kind of decolonial and minoritized circles with people that wouldn't necessarily call themselves socialists or Marxists. It's what I'm kind of trying to get at here is what value does looking at things decolonially, and even looking at an instance of like Israel and Palestine or other kind of events of taking sides in these colonizer versus colonizee, what values does this necessarily bring to the left, and how is this kind of advancing the cause of leftism? In which way? Yeah.
Responses? Elio?
I think that it's like the colonizer-oppressor dichotomy or binary is like not necessarily helpful to us in this moment of like globalized neoliberalism and stuff. Like I think like especially like if you like some people like hold the identity of the colonizer and the colonized like in their bodies too. So it's like, how do you have a more nuanced understanding of how colonialism shows up materially, like within people's identities and within relationships. Understanding that it's not a binary or a dichotomy, and that it's like a very nuanced conversation. Yeah, that's it.
Anyone else like to
I would
take
say,
that?
okay,
Yeah.
so I would say that so one of the things that basically happened at the end of the Cold War was that the tradition of kind of orthodox Marxism, classical Marxism of the Communist Party and kind of Stalinism, began to wither away. And in the 90s, you got like a resurgence basically in activist circles and intellectual circles and some presses and journals of anarchism and of a kind of different revolutionary legacy that had been sort of submerged by the much more famous, as it were, but akin movement of the communists and the socialists in the 20th century. And so since the 90s, basically, we've had interest in like indigenous movements and interest in forms of like direct action and protest politics, whether it was like the anti-WTO protests of the late 90s or like the kind of Zapatista form of Marxism in Mexico in the 90s, you know, whatever. So there's been like this kind of like whole awakening basically of historical peoples and struggles and movements that kind of the narrative domination of Marxism and the communist tradition kind of submerged and made harder to make seen and legible. So I've lived through that whole kind of period too, and obviously there's good things about it. I don't want to dismiss that whole period that we've been through. It's led to a lot more free thinking, unorthodox kinds of positions, heterodox ideas. There's been a kind of opening up of dialectics in certain ways that I think can be interesting. Now, on the other hand, if you look at like a text like Lenin's Imperialism, and you look at it carefully, and most Marxists, traditionally speaking, we didn't really think of this kind of like colonial situation in simple terms, like colonist, oppressor, you know, like, because the people who came here as colonists were often like, you know, like destitute whites and whatever, you know, they were like basically like slaves for 7 years and this kind of like indentured servant dynamic. And, you know, so it wasn't like, for Marxists, it's always about this kind of class dynamic and like, you know, the people who are coming in here and that were like white settlers, they weren't exactly like the bourgeoisie. Now, some of them, of course, became bourgeois, and they became very wealthy, and new fortunes were created, but it would be a little simplistic in that way. And again, if you look at Lenin's Imperialism, like, if you think about the discourse of the contemporary university, you might think that Lenin's got like all kinds of things in there about like settler colonies, but actually there's almost nothing at all in there about settler colonial dynamics. I think maybe there's a passage in like chapter 8 or 9, which is relatively short, and basically what he means by imperialism are these, like what David was talking about, these very modern capitalist powers that have these dominating financial classes that basically are arranging for investment around the planet, and they're running into bottlenecks of what they can scramble to possess and financialize, and they're starting to be drawn into warfare with each other, starting to be drawn into combat, you know, this kind of monopoly, state conditions of capitalism. Also, there's very interesting things there in his theorization about capitalism itself, in imperialism, that are often overlooked, and that maybe we can think about the contemporary currency of them. So I think that there's a kind of contradiction I would want to bring out, which is that there's something to a more free-thinking, heterodox, unorthodox, post-90s kind of left ideas. Anarchist ideas have come back, indigenous struggles, thinking through like anti-colonial movements again. But also we need to have a very careful understanding about that history. We need to think about the very modern, like what Richard was getting at, I thought was very good, is kind of very modern forces of modern industry, very, very much transforming the globe in totally unprecedented ways just in the last 100 years, and especially in the last, say, like 75 years. And that's the kind of thing Lenin was emphasizing, as opposed to just like a history, a kind of moralizing history about settler dynamics. So I want to have both of those ideas in mind.
Great. Thanks. More questions from the audience? Holden?
Yeah. You're Elio, right?
Mm-hmm.
Elio, Shaun, and you at the end there, you're David, right?
David Lau. Yes, David Lau.
You all brought up some concept of like indigenous power as being important in some respect. And I'm kind of going to ask the question just, what does that mean to like a Marxism or a left? Like, what would it mean to have indigenous power? And I'm not saying that in the sense of like, tell me exactly your 10-point plan, but like, is it something that you imagine a 10-point plan for? Is it not, etc.? And for you, David, specifically, because you mentioned it in the context of anarchism, like what connection to anarchism does indigenous power hold for you? Like it's in that same moment of like the heterodox, like sort of unfolding of anarchist thought in the modern contemporary sort of place. So why does indigenous power become important then?
Well, I would just say that that I wouldn't want to reify indigenous people as like, like perfect people or whatever. And there's lots of questions here. The largest indigenous community in the world is in India. Largest tribal community in the world is, tribal peoples are still in India, subcontinent of India. So, that's oftentimes people have no concept of that and don't know anything about the Naxalites and, any of this kind of stuff. So, I think if we thought about the indigenous movement in Latin America, basically, I would give examples in like Bolivia or Venezuela or, Andean peoples movements that have effloresced in the recent period. And like, there was a kind of experience that they had in Bolivia where indigenous groups took local initiatives seriously and tried to, very much like the kind of things you guys are talking about, like these land back ideas, or like, having like, their own cooperatives and all this kind of stuff, like taking over land that was disused, using principles that were in the Constitution and like asserting them in courts. This still goes on in South Africa, for example. To like be able to take over like a vineyard that's possessed by some family, and there's all these poor, basically homeless, landless blacks in South Africa still. So, but in Latin America, if you looked at Bolivia, they basically had the experience where like that wasn't enough. That you would have these kind of local indigenous initiatives, and then they would come up against like bigger political and capitalistic and investment forces. And ultimately they had to organize into a political party. And that's where you go from like this kind of protest and, like indigenous like assertion of like authority over local dynamics to like actually having a big political party like MAS, which has a Marxist theorist, Linera, and it has a famous leader, Evo Morales. And they actually had to like win power, and then they had to like take on like state building kind of initiatives, and they had this kind of like Andean social democratic ideology. I would say again, they're not really able to have full scale revolutions. We can talk about maybe why that's the case, but some of it has to do with like military power and the kind of strength of the U.S. in terms of training a lot of the soldiers in Latin America and a lot of the military officers in Latin America. But I don't want to equate the anarchist thing with the indigenous thing, because I don't think they're exactly the same. I was just merely pointing out that after the end of the Cold War, suddenly different historical agents or actors were being thought about again in new ways, and there's been a lot of good to that, even if there's sometimes theoretical or historical vices that come along with it. That was the only kind of point I was trying to make. I'm talking too much.
And the first part of your question, Holden?
Yeah, it was for like Elio and Shaun.
Those
You
countries in
mentioned
Latin America where
indigenous
indigenous
power.
people have played the biggest role. It's places where there's a large indigenous population.
Exactly,
There,
yeah.
the indigenous struggle
Yes.
blends into the class struggle.
Massive majorities and these like famous class struggle theaters like in Cochabamba, Cochabamba.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and places where the settler colonialism has reduced the indigenous population to a tiny minority, the indigenous people have basically no power.
Yeah.
Like Argentina.
I mean, the other thing I would stress,
That's also true,
I would
yeah.
like this kind of acknowledged, is the extent of the defeats of the left, particularly over the last
Of course.
50 years.
Yeah.
Right, you know, we spoke about the encampments, and for example, it seems to me the encampments have disappeared. And there's another question which really puzzles me, because I've gone to some anti-war protests against the Iran war, and they're tiny. There's hardly any anti-war movement, and that is very peculiar, given the fact that opinion polls show that the American public is 3-1 against the war. So why, if you had a left that could protest Israel, which, you know, was a foreign country that the U.S. was subsidizing, why you can't have a direct protest against an unpopular war? I mean, that to me is very mysterious.
Well, I do think that the conditions of the repression of the student movement have continued. And so now for there to be protests like on campus, Richard, here, it's much more difficult than it was. Like that, the repression
Maybe
is
explains
active and
the-
ongoing in that sense, right? So to try to get the thing up off the ground again is more forbidding than it was in 2023, 2024. And like we heard already about the sanctions that Elio and others faced. So that's had a huge I mean, they've banned Students for Justice in Palestine at the UC. They've taken steps to make this more difficult. Now, I do think that with Iran, there's the question of the successful ideological demonization of Islamism that's been a product of the war on terror. And so we have to reckon with that fact that these people and this country has been very much demonized. And I think that the historical construction of a positive image of the Palestinian people is a victory of that movement there. And it was possible for large numbers of people to sympathize with them because of the poetry, the filmmaking, the famous politicians and political figures, many of whom have just been assassinated and, you know, over the years and whatever. And so there's a way in which the Palestinian issue is politically constructed for people to sympathize with, whereas the Iranian one, it's more difficult, and there's been this ongoing demonization, and even now, it's like, you know, how do you know, the Vietnamese people were an object of a lot of sympathy, and it's going to take time to construct. If we're going to have an anti-war movement, we have to construct sympathy for the Iranian people over and against this kind of legacy of demonization. So I think that's kind of how I would distinguish the two problems in a way.
Can I answer Holden's question? I think, like, to talk about indigenous power, you have to talk about, like, add more nuance to what indigenous means. I just had a conversation with my roommate where she was talking about how, like, she grew up on a reservation, and in her community, like, doesn't matter if you're native, if you act native. Like, for example, if a family were to adopt, like, a white kid or something, like, if you're acting native, if you're participating in the community, you are considered native by that community. So I think in terms of, like, and we all, like, have a homeland in a sense. I think, so when we talk about indigenous power, it's like centering and uplifting that knowledge of indigeneity and acknowledging our own distance from, or me as a white person, distance from my homeland, my culture, and trying to trying to repair that relationship. I think, like, the majority of organizing is interpersonal dynamics, interpersonal relationships with your friends, your family, how you talk to your mom about what you learn in school. Like, that is the grunt work of it, in my opinion. And so when we have conversations about identity, I think we can get really rigid about who you are, this rigid fixed identity, but we are all shifting and we are all in transition. So when I talk about, like, how like land back, like indigenous liberation, like Palestine liberation movements are like local and so important. I think I'm talking about we need to reimagine our relationship with the land and like each other. And it's not necessarily saying like, oh, like uplift one group of people to decide how things go. That's not really how it works. But there's also like not, I lost it for a second. I have one more thing though. It's like, I relate it to the idea of queerness. Like to me, being queer is an act, and it's not a stagnant identity that you can inhabit. It is a choice to, it is a lens through which you see the world that you take on. It is being politicized in your movement through the world and understanding that as struggle, revolutionary struggle. So indigenous people, migrants, like diaspora, people of a diaspora, like the Palestinian diaspora, the way they move through the world is so politicized, and that is what is, like, that is their struggle, and that is, like, revolutionary struggle, in my opinion, so.
So I can respond. Well, okay. So first off, I just want to be clear about expectations here, because I'm here in my capacity as a political theorist, and not as like a political strategist or something like this. So I want to start by saying, while I want to get to the root of the problem, I also realize that what I'm about to say, its practical consequences might be difficult to see, but I think what I would say, and I think like actually this goes to both of your questions in a certain way, because when we talk about something like indigenous power or what it means to decolonize, I think what we have to ask ourselves is how the forms of oppression that we're looking at reproduce themselves. And so in particular, capital is particular because of the necessary forms of appearance that capital requires. So when we think about the individual, when we think of the form of property that capital produces and needs, when we think of the nation, when we think of the state, when we think of individual rights, these things are endemic to capital and make it so that in certain ways we're less powerful. So when I was talking about land back, one of the points that I was trying to make is that it would be abstract to simply say, well, give these parts of the United States to the indigenous tribes so that they can set up their own casinos or like something like this. Like this is like it doesn't change anything really, right? The part of the point is that the mere conception of property, by which it goes from being something that is a means for reproduction of people and nature, that itself has to be shepherded in a certain way, sort of cultivated and maintained, to something where you can own it to the point at which you can completely destroy it if that's your desire to do so. Like this is a radical change that happened 5 minutes ago in human history, right? But it's necessary to capital, and so this conception of property is radically different from other conceptions of property. So to build, I think, indigenous power would mean looking at how some of these forms are antithetical to their ability to achieve their political demands, but also how this necessitates a deep enough and broad enough sort of coalition and set of practices, concepts. Did I say practices?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to push on something that came up between David and Richard and everyone else, which is this idea of having sympathy across the planet and the world. You pointed out that the Palestinians, who have a huge diaspora in the U.S., were able to really have all of this, poetry and art and create this connection across the world. And then also you pointed out how, in Latin America, it's those are very local native struggles that happen to have a large indigenous component to them. And I want to ask about what the difference between people who are trying to from the diaspora trying to advocate for their own nation back there, whether it be exiled Iranians or Palestinians, versus the situations in Latin America where it seems like or in the U.S. perhaps, where it seems like the indigenous people are just part of like the kind of regular political bloc in their country, and like what this sympathetic subject. Because David, you said we need this sort of sympathetic subject to like.
Well, I think for an anti-war
reemerge.
movement, you have for a big popular anti-war movement, the sine qua non of them all has always been sympathy for the people under attack. The people under attack are constructed by the anti-war movement as a people for whom we should have, despite what our government is telling us, we should have sympathy. And I think that if you look at the success of the war on terrorism from a propaganda and ideological perspective, it's been that they've really constructed a kind of evil enemy, and it's difficult for the weak voices of a totally defeated left or whatever to basically reconstitute, this idea of like a sympathetic subject. Now, in the case of the Palestinians, it's a 20th century movement. It's got many generations of activists that have built up the story and the ideas and the poetry and all these kinds of things. So, in a way, the student encampments were able to get this kind of free ride on the organized infrastructure of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement for its many generations. They're kind of able to get this sort of free ride and like really be able to advocate and like learn a lot by listening to Rashid Khalidi on YouTube or whatever. I learned a lot like very quickly, and like people are all adept in discussion, and and with Iran it's much more challenging. Like the Islamic Republic of Iran is the product of a very unique struggle in the late 1970s in which the old left of Iran more or less had to, because it was so ruthlessly oppressed and suppressed by the Shah, it had to kind of unite with this clerical grouping that was like one of the only spaces in Iran where there couldn't be direct political monitoring. The mosques were kind of zones where politics could start to develop there. And then within the first maybe 5 or 6 years of the revolutionary period in the early 1980s, the old left of Iran was completely exterminated. And they lost basically in this kind of Thermidorian Stalinization, kind of Islamist Stalinization of the revolution by like the mid-1980s. So
By Khomeini.
Yes, indeed, yeah, and by the clerical establishment. So it's very difficult in even for people like ourselves, like Marxists, to develop a kind of sympathetic relationship to the Islamic Republic. But it doesn't mean that's still what we have to do.
Right.
And we always have to emphasize, I think, in a way that the problem isn't just like, Iran or like Palestine. The problem is that these same forces are doing the same things to us. Life is not just getting worse in Palestine, of course it is. It's not just getting worse, of course it's getting worse here. It's getting worse here because we are disorganized, because we lack political parties. We lack movements with hard shells and carapaces that can survive. And ultimately these people who are doing all these gnarly things, Jimmy Panetta and whoever, they're doing it right here in Santa Cruz County. This is the homeland of capitalism. We live in the belly of the beast, as it were. So, when we're thinking about these kind of things, I agree with what Elio's getting at. These are kind of local issues in a way, and contesting the power of the capitalist class. It's always about our own situation, our own lives here in the United States.
Kevin.
I think it's rather ahistorical to say that anti-war movements depend upon sympathy for the enemy. I mean, certainly in the Vietnam War, only a small percentage of the protesters against the Vietnam War had sympathy with the Viet Cong.
Even though the major chant and slogan was "Ho Ho Ho Chi Minh."
Yeah, but if you look at the masses of people who turned up at the anti-war protests, you're talking about people who are fundamentally liberals. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had those massive protests, right? I'm not denying that there were people who are plenty of new leftists who are sympathetic to, right? Like, what's striking to me about the present political moment in the United States is the United States is fighting a war which Trump just started and didn't even bother to explain or sell the way Bush did the earlier cycle of Middle East wars. And the war is clearly unpopular with the American public. And yet you can only get tiny, disorganized protests, which I've seen against the war. That says something. What it says, I don't know, but I don't think that it's just because the Islamic Republic is widely perceived, quite correctly, as a deeply repugnant regime, which it is, and which we should call it that.
Kevin.
Although it's not.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah. So I think the four panelists, besides Elio, have taken for granted in much of the discussion, especially with the opening remarks and some of the later stuff. Two things. The first, and especially with David, Walters, and Richard, of decolonization as sort of a substitute for the failure of World Socialist Revolution, like insofar that there wasn't something like World Socialist Revolution in the 1910s and 20s. Decolonization is the byproduct of that world. I took David, Walters, and Richard to be getting at that. And the second thing that's kind of been taken for granted implicitly is a certain sort of exhaustion of decolonization in maybe a more colloquial sense, like whether in academia, activism, or leftism. Like one has to imagine a sort of more ambivalent and critical attitudes espoused by you four as the older panelists might have been much harder to have this discussion in the 1980s as like a left forum.
I was a small child in the 1980s.
There you go, as a left event. And Elio also raised, I think, decolonization in the responses, but insofar it was not brought up explicitly in the opening remarks, there kind of was like an implicit assumption that decolonization was inherently relevant as a framework to that of the Palestinian solidarity encampments, which Elio helpfully clarified it was more explicitly in the rejoinder. But then it seems as the conversation went on, you seemed eager as the young student to learn from these older people with about a bunch of life advice on the more historical trajectory of decolonization. So there's not really a question per se, but I want to hear from the panelists to reflect on the sort of phenomenon that's here, right? How one can acknowledge a certain sort of exhaustion of decolonization as a framework, especially maybe more recently.
That's the kind of thing I would say. Is it exhausted? I mean, if we have this kind of world where, the Israel issue is the Israel-Palestine issue is so fundamental to contemporary politics, could we say it's exhausted? I would say that actually there's a way in which, like I was saying about fascism, it kind of speaks to the present, even if I sometimes have problems with exactly how it's being used or exactly what's being said, and I think that I don't think it's exhausted as a term or a framework.
Hang on, David raises his hand.
I agree with you. I think there is I don't mean you said that everybody's exhausted, but you were posing it as a question.
Right.
I think there is among activists like Elio's you guys out there, and the undergraduates and graduates. Yeah, there's a certain amount of exhaustion. You're not going to see encampments again very soon anywhere that I can think of. It's just people are tired. The other reason is people go home on vacation and it's hard to reorganize everybody again. I saw that at Skyline Community College where I was organizing. They had Students for Justice for Palestine there. It's gone. It's just not that it was suppressed. It wasn't. It's just students go on after 2 years and they go to the other universities. There is that sort of a thing, especially when you're dealing with international stuff. That's as opposed to say tuition hikes, which was a big thing 15 years ago. Mobilized tens of thousands of people at the UCs and especially at the CSUs, and it went on for 2 years. It just didn't last for a summer or a spring or a fall semester. Dave, 2 words that describe why demonstrations were big in the 60s and 70s. Body bags. Walter Cronkite.
Exactly. Yeah.
When I was a kid, my parents were involved in my mom was the founder of a Women's Strike for Peace, and I was in the student mobilization committee to end the war in Vietnam. Every Thursday night, everybody watched Walter Cronkite on CBS. would come on and give 250 American GIs were killed this week,
Right.
right? Week after week after week. This created the what the fuck are we doing there? Not the kind of what the fuck are we doing there that a lot of MAGA people are asking, and everybody else. I will go out on the limb and say, had the Iranian counterstrikes in the first 2 days of the war killed 1,000 American GIs, those bases that they flattened but didn't kill very many people, would have been a very different political situation we have today in Congress and in other places, including I think with mass demonstrations. That doesn't explain, though, I think it doesn't contradict whatsoever what you said, because about having a sort of liberal or moral sympathy with the victims. And this explains why you have like a general strike in Ireland, where 100,000 people march in Dublin, in a country of 5 million people. It's huge. In England, huge demonstrations violating the law of carrying a Palestinian flag. Hundreds of thousands of people. France, a whole bunch of other countries, even in Japan. I saw like Palestine. I was there a year ago in May. In Sapporo in the north, isolated north, and there were people with Palestinian flags hanging from the windows. So the fact is that the war is televised, and the thousands of people are dying, and everybody knows it, and Israel's at fault, and the United States is at fault, generated, I think, that sympathy. We have a thing here, Richard, I don't know if you were leading on, but I think you know why these demonstrations are so small beyond the objective lack of consciousness. I think there's a problem with the dominant socialist groups that organize these things. That's number one. It shouldn't be socialist groups that are organizing this thing. It should be the church groups. It should be community organizations. It should be the unions, all of whom have taken positions against the war in Iran. But they don't do it. They don't take this united front approach toward mobilizing everybody. I can name names. I'm not going to do that.
I was actually struck by the opposite, the absence of radicals. I mean, all the people I saw at the protest.
Oh, not where I was.
They were older white people. I mean, the only non-white person was my girlfriend. I was among the youngest people there. And it was clearly a liberal group. I mean,
yes,
I
agree.
It's typical rural Western Mass, but it wasn't.
I don't have an answer for that specific situation. A lot of the older people that come to demonstrations in San Francisco that I go to, because I live near San Francisco, as opposed to in the woods down here, they're all older white people like me with gray hair who are all former leftists. We have a mass ex-leftist community. That's who come. Just like here in Santa Cruz, you have a lot of anarchists from generations.
I was going to address what you said. Well,
sorry.
No. Well, I mean, I think you're right. That like on the one hand, I think part of what might be frustrating even at times is that with the fall of the USSR, there was a serious depletion of like leftist resources, which meant less leftist energy in a lot of ways. That was, I mean, I think to your point, David, sort of replaced in some ways by like postmodernism, but also by like decolonial thought. But I think also what came out in a number of the talks was that this sort of reached an apex with like the decoloniality people. And you brought up the sort of like takedown of this. I think a lot of people have been highly critical of like thinking of colonialism or coloniality as like mostly an epistemological kind of concern. I think this has been a problem to a lot of people, and it's sort of like sucked out a lot of the energy from that kind of like long-term trajectory in a certain way. So I think that goes to like part of what you were saying. But this sort of like weakening of the left. I mean, I don't know when the last time the left was weaker across the world than it is today. I think in the U.S. though, it also is important that I think on the one hand, like concerns over, we saw like BLM, and then attention turned to Palestine. And now, yeah, I mean, it is strange. I agree that like there aren't a bunch of like massive protests against Iran, but I think like people's attention was also like on ICE, for instance, and even on Trump doing things like recently. So my research is on fascism, And so I've been tracking Trump very closely in certain ways, in part because I want to know how long I can stay in this country and feel safe. So part of what I've been tracking is how every few weeks he adds groups of people to who counts as terrorists. Like 2 weeks ago, anti-fascists were even to be counted among terrorists and potentially people who could go to prison at some point and so on and so forth. I don't know that most people are so aware of that, but I do think that there's something in the air where people realize, like, maybe I don't want to be protesting so as freely as I have in the past because of what we've been seeing from the Trump administration. I don't think this is the whole answer. I think we're putting on the table a lot of. I think we're putting a lot of things on the table that help to explain this, but I think it's a complex thing that's explaining why there's like nothing politically going on as far as a lot of.
Obviously, there's something happening domestically which one would take as a sign of them prepping us for permanently escalated warfare. And one of the dynamics would be repression of street protests or protests, organized protests, which otherwise might get going or could get going. So I definitely have had that thought. Obviously there's lots of dangers given the strength of the right, not just in the Republican Party, but the right wing in the Democratic Party. So you have this kind of like what Tariq Ali called the extreme center, where it's like this kind of like center of American politics, which is like these kind of like psycho killer imperialists, for lack of more concrete. I'll be a little abstract and just say they're imperialists or whatever, but that's in the Republican Party, it's in the right wing of the Democratic Party, and they seem to be prepping us for an escalated war kind of footing and war condition. Now, on the flip side, what I would say is that there are some silver linings to the existing situation. One is that they've obviously been humiliated in the Iranian debacle, the U.S. capitalist military kind of imperialist class. And then on the further side of that, because of the loss in the trade war, the United States has no access to rare earth metals and rare earth magnets, the vast majority of which are manufactured, processed, mined in China. And China is not going to allow the United States to have access to these critical minerals and magnets. And every weapon that they fire off is a weapon that they're never, ever going to be able to rebuild. So we have a really decrepit intellectual leadership at the top of the American capitalist class that can't really even see very far into the future, where they cannot maintain this kind of military footing, and really it's being undermined.
I think Hegseth is outsmarting us all, actually.
No, I would just like to say something which will make me sound completely like an old leftist, which is that imperialism is not a policy. That it is part of a social structure of a particular phase of capitalism.
Of course, yes.
In that respect, the effect of this war probably will help the Democrats in the midterm. But even if the Democrats win, and even if not merely the right-wing Democrats, but the left wing of the Democratic Party wins, the United States will remain in that Leninist sense, insofar as Lenin's theory of imperialism is correct, an imperialist country. And the only thing that would transform that is not a change in the government, but essentially a social revolution in the United States and throughout the world. And that seems totally utopian now, but it also seems clearly the only thing that would change the present fundamentally.
I think intermediary events could be consequential, though. I agree with that, but intermediary events could be consequential. More military defeats for the U.S.
To do like kind of like a meta-analysis as you've done of like the panel, I feel like I'm kind of like, I don't understand why we need to talk about the problem. Well, I do understand, but like it's like the reasons for like no strong organized left are more clear to me, and I think that's more because of like culture. I think we really need to be talking about culture. Like I could go on about the organizing culture at UCSC and the fighting that goes on. it's ridiculous. It's like we are reproducing authoritarian practices and policies like in our interpersonal relationships, which is why I'm emphasizing it so much, is that like the way that we interact with each other and build relationships with each other is like step number one, because the culture needs to change, like the culture of apathy and the feeling of domination that most people just like walk through their lives with is a result of authoritarian practices and policies in the government, a result of kids who get their first phone at age 7 and are their digital footprint, and they turn 18, they realize their digital footprint actually is going to have an impact on them the whole time, and that they've been surveilled their whole lives, and like surveillance really changes the culture of what we do, because we, like, young people think that there could be a camera on them at any time, and it probably assume that there will be. And I feel like that really, like the panopticon of it all, like, I don't know. We can talk about culture forever, but I feel like that needs to be really
That'd be a good
part
panel
of the
discussion.
conversation. Yeah.
That would be a good panel discussion.
Do we have more questions from the audience? And we can also continue over here, but I want to give people a chance from the audience to ask any more questions to the panelists, because we're nearing time.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you spoke a bit about like how like this anti-colonial nationalism. To me, when I hear the word nationalism, as a bit of a leftist, I have a knee-jerk reaction to say we really shouldn't do that. So I just want to ask all of the panelists, to what degree is like this, let's say, patriotic, to put it nicely? To what degree is
I was the one who was
patriotism-
bringing that up.
Yeah.
I was bringing that up.
I'm on the opposite side of that.
So do you guys?
What I was trying to get at was the famous argument of Benedict Anderson in Imagined Communities. So without going into all that, I would just say, check out that book. Mm-hmm. It's basically a Marxist attempt to really have like a Copernican turn in the way that the Marxist revolutionary left thinks about nationalism. Now, he's been also famously criticized very strongly for that book, which I wouldn't want to ignore, and I think a lot of the criticisms are pretty resonant. But yeah, there's effectively been a kind of way that nationalisms of various kinds have been able to appeal to human consciousness and been able to inspire in national subjects ultimate sacrifices, struggles to the death for the nation. And so what Anderson is trying to do in the book is basically like show how there is a kind of content of nationalism in this kind of mode of patriotism. Now, Anderson's almost universally positive account of nationalism requires careful curation. He has to curate the examples very carefully, and he like doesn't look at like fascist nationalism in the sense of like fascism and Nazism, the obvious negative examples. But he's coming out of a situation where he was a scholar of Indonesia. Indonesia was a very famous kind of anti-colonial theater that had the largest communist party in the world outside of the Soviet Union, that kind of was connected to the military in the wake of its liberation, and then famously the United States backed a coup in Vietnam, in Indonesia, which probably killed, I don't know, 1 million or so communists. So 1 million people were killed in the wake of the coup in Indonesia. So Anderson was kind of coming out of that experience in Indonesia, and then looking at these kind of examples in the Philippines and Vietnam, and the kind of the world of what was called Indochina, and Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and that sort of thing. So I wanted to bring that up because I think that we're sort of losing the Anderson attempt to kind of rethink nationalism from this Marxist left perspective. And I think it's still, even if you have criticisms of him, which a lot of people did, it's really worth reading that text to kind of get a sense of what he's trying to get at about nationalism, and particularly this last wave. That's a chapter in the book of anti-colonial nationalism.
I want to let Shaun respond, but I also just want to put one gloss on that, which is because it was these heroic nationalism of the Palestinians that incited the, period of civil social organizing in the U.S. around the encampments. And Phil was talking about, it also seems like nationalism is not an end in and of itself. Do we seem like we're in a position where we need some kind of martyr nationalistic figure in some other country to actually motivate social organizing in the U.S.?
I think that we have had a left, Richard was getting at this kind of the left today and the weakness of we've had a left which since the 90s has been a kind of alter global left and a kind of left that wants to think about sort of the world in this kind of movement sense, and basically this kind of post-90s left has been really wrong-footed in a context where there's been all this resurgence of nationalism. So I think it's a challenge for us today to kind of think about the nation. Now I am someone who tries to be a realist politically. I am a Marxist. I think of myself as an old Bolshevik, in fact. But I think that at the same time, we don't have those kinds of organizing and political conditions, and we don't have a conscious revolutionary proletariat at the point of production in the steel foundries and whatever. So I just think that we're in very difficult conditions today, and that when we think about nationalisms, we want to maybe think about them in terms like Perry Anderson uses, anti-systemic movements. There are some forms of nationalism today that may be able to fulfill that role of being an anti-systemic movement. So Anderson looks, for example, at the Catalan national movement in Spain, which had been heavily repressed in recent years, right? Previously, we could have maybe thought about the Scottish national movement, and these are national movements which take very political forms, Republican forms. They're not ethnic national movements. In fact, they very much privilege this idea of not being about where you're from. The national struggle is not about where you're from, it's about where you fight. And given the structure of the interstate system, the nation will remain a crucial theater of struggle because it is where we fight. It is where we take the first steps in political fights, is inside of the nations that we live in. So it remains a kind of, for me, an unavoidable question, thinking about the nation and about this kind of situation of what we have to do here and now. And obviously that's very important in this nation, this very, very powerful nation that has so much influence around the planet.
I think I basically agree with what I understood to be your point. On the one hand, I think it is important to read Anderson's book, and I think there's a lot that we can gain from it. And I also think that there are good reasons to be sympathetic to those movements that are meant to overcome, their colonial rule. Nonetheless, I think for me, what's part of the issue is that the abstractness of the nation form is one that articulates very closely with forms of property, with the individual, with abstract rights given by the state, and so on and so forth. So that it's really kind of a piece with capitalism. So it'd be one thing to think of an anti-nationalist movement. So this was actually part of my talk, which you missed, which is fine. But it'd be one thing to think of a movement, an anti-colonial nationalist movement that saw as part of its goal to shed off all of those forms, because what we see in these movements is that they're still wedded to property. They're still wedded to the idea of the individual. They're still wedded to the nation state. They're wedded to these forms that inevitably make it so that it ought not be surprising when they themselves are hooked into the global circuit of capital and so on and so forth. So it's one thing to think of, to have sympathy for those movements that want to overcome their colonial domination. I don't have an example for this, but I'm just saying, if I tried to think of the best kind of scenario for this, it would be one where, they recognize their oppression as the thing that binds them, but also recognize the emptiness of that in terms of like, this tribe from this area and this village and like these people from the other side of the mountains, whatever, they're not the same. And they have like different practices, different traditions, different histories, different customs. And part of the problem with capital is its abstraction and the need to be concrete about what it is that you value, what your practices and institutions are, and how you're reproducing the conditions of your life in a just way. This, I don't think, can easily be solved, through forms such as the nation and the individual and so on and so forth.
Okay. So we're gonna moving towards time, so we want to move towards closing remarks, but I also want to have, any more audience members who want to ask a question to the panelists before we do that.
I need to leave at 8.
Okay, so yeah,
if we can just do quick closing remarks.
I have to leave soon too, but may I respond to the question of nationalism?
Could you do that and also fold in your closing remarks?
I don't really have closing
Okay,
remarks.
great.
But that would be the closing remarks.
That's your closing remark. Let's go.
So I would say 2 things. One is nationalism in its origin is liberal. It's part of the bourgeois revolutions. It comes out of the period of there are pre-modern forms of nationalism, but nationalism in its modern form is connected with liberalism. In that respect, Marx and Engels were often sympathetic to European nationalism, as were other European liberals. In the later part of the 19th century, it gets hijacked by the right. The question of anti-systemic nationalism, right, the third world, anti-colonial nationalism, again, I would push back on that. I think that the anti-systemic character of any nationalism, of anti-colonial nationalism, etc., has been vastly overrated. I think that the radical potential of decolonization was greatly exaggerated. So I am extremely skeptical of that, which is separate from the question of whether one can support nationalism in a given case. But again, I'm saying nationalism, if one is talking about self-determination, is of course supportable as a liberal right, as other liberal rights. But one should not imagine that supporting that is really anti-systemic, that it's undermining capitalism, that it's furthering the liberation of humanity from capitalism. And the goal of Marxism has always been the overcoming of the nation state. It's always the idea is of a socialist federation of humanity, which would be the end of nationalism. But anyway, I took too much time in my opening remarks, so I'll leave more time for other people.
Thanks. We want to give an opportunity for the panels to respond to Richard, to close out, and start with Elio, and move towards David.
I want to just remind everyone to read Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Tuck and Yang. I think that it really places this conversation in the context of United States settler colonialism. And also, I'm trying to, my perspective is that praxis, basically. Putting, decolonization in the context of this university. We're on stolen land of the Amamutsan people, and the, university is, currently pushing people out and who can't afford to live here. Workers are undocumented and not protected by the state. There's all of this myriad of issues that take place on our campus, and there's a myriad of ways to get involved. We can have the conversations, but if they don't leave this room, what happens? If they don't exist so I just want to think about how will you take this conversation with you in your time here on campus? Who will you talk to about it? How are you going to put it into action? And that's just kind of what I want to leave you here with, because I want to make sure we're all clear about why we're talking about this, and it's because there are urgent issues that need to be addressed, and we need to address them as students with political power on this campus. So, yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks.
Yes.
Okay.
And
David?
Yeah, so, in closing, I still, like Richard did in his opening remarks, question the utility of the term decolonization, though it's very good for analytical's purpose. It's like intersectionality, you've all heard of that. It's a postmodern expression that is really good stuff when it comes to analysis, but is terrible when it comes to building a united front across differences that people have. So, because it requires a political adherence to all sorts of different things that doesn't work in the real world, in my opinion. So that's just on decolonization. I basically didn't agree with didn't disagree with any of the other
It
speakers.
would have been so much more fun if you had stuck to you not agreeing with any of us on anything.
No, I know, that would have been more fun. And I didn't get to deliver a defense of Lenin on Richard's comments. I'm not going to do it now. But I will address nationalism. I thought it was a good question. Nationalism is like populism. It's the same meaning in the sense that populism, you could have left populism of La Follette, or you could have right populism of Donald Trump. It depends on in the specific situation, the context, whether it's progressive or reactionary. The same is true, in my opinion, of nationalism. I hold to Lenin's position that you don't put an equal sign between the oppressed and the oppressor, and that you always support the nationalism of the oppressed. Again, and that's per situation. You can have very if you study American history, it's just like, the great people from 1848, whoever brought that up, many of the German exiles came and went in to start massacring Native Americans in California during the gold rush. The great communards who were fighting a national war against the Prussians, right, who were getting very, very strong in a centralized Germany, in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. Thousands went to Algeria to become settlers. I find these contradictions really delicious. I think they're what makes human history so interesting to me. So it's just like, in the labor movement, you have these, white nationalist workers in Flint, Michigan, who are about to go on strike because Chevy was going to hire some black workers. It was, outside of where were supposed to be hired, outside the dangerous jobs. That actually occurs in labor history. So nationalism can be, I support the Palestinian national movement. It's 10 years ago, I detested Hamas because they specifically rejected the national movement. That's why they never flew the Palestinian flag until recently. They started carrying the Palestinian flag because they're a religious organization. We haven't even discussed the problems of religion and evangelicalism in Brazil and Guatemala, and it's a right-wing force and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, whoever said it about nationalism in a specific context, it needs to be examined in that context. I oppose American patriotism. I'll always oppose American patriotism. There's nothing, it's like Mark Twain said, it's the repository for fools or whatever. It's used to justify every reactionary aspect, There are groups that pose as American communists and try to put themselves in a pro-American perspective while being leftist and stuff. I think it's contradictory. It won't work, and it's not going to recruit anybody to communism. So,
Thanks, David.
That's it.
Well, you said you got to go right at 8. Do you want to go first?
We have 5 minutes.
I'll stay till everybody's talk.
Okay.
I'm not going to leave early.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the goals of decolonization are really important, but maybe I'll just rehash what's sort of my alternative way to think about these things in my talk, which is that, I think to Elio's point, the question of what people want on this campus and how we can actually provide for people's needs, right? Even here on this campus, the food sucks on this campus. I don't know if people realize this, but I would personally be pretty happy to see students organizing something just a community, some way to get people fed, for instance. I don't know what other kinds of versions of this sort of thing there might be, but to this end. I'm just going to plug something real quick, but there are a group of us on this campus who are starting a sociology of scientific labor working group, and we're dealing with, it might not sound intuitive why a group would be called that and still dealing with some of the issues that we're talking about, but if anybody's interested in that, you can hit me up and we can talk.
David?
Oh man, I mean,
You're up now.
It's like, what?
Weight of history is on your shoulders.
You've hardly spoken, come on.
I don't really know that I have too much more to say. I think that my concern, with how I would try to respond. Like, if we think back, this kind of thing got brought up by David about the Occupy movement on campus in 2009, and then the Occupy Wall Street thing that happened in 2011, and there was a lot of continuity between campus protests and Occupy Oakland and Occupy Santa Cruz and whatnot. If we think about that period, there were lots of limitations to the protests and the organizations and the groups, and like there were many this problem of like the interpersonal. Mm-hmm. There are many problems of the interpersonal, and in fact the cancellation dynamics were terrible at that time, and they I think it's like the sinking ship dynamic of the protest movements is that everyone starts canceling each other. But if you look back to 2009, I think what you did see very clearly was that there was some kind of more rational Marxism in the air. And part of it had to do with the financial crisis and the need to have an account of like what was happening with global capitalism became very important. And when I look at like what's happening today, I don't see that same intellectual atmosphere among the activists around the Palestinian question, which for me is concerning. So what I would want to do in terms of like this question you raised, Elio, of like how are we going to use the conversation or take the conversation, and I would want to try as much as possible to reintroduce a very rational Marxist perspective into the contemporary debates about like what should be done or what should be supported or how to get the anti-war movement going again. I think that we're poised for a big crash. Whether it's going to be because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz or because the AI bubble is going to burst apart or whatever. And I think that again, in that kind of context, the kind of economic theories or whatever of Marx will rear their head up, and maybe we can hope for a situation where we can start to introduce that kind of intellectual perspective in a bit more grounded way, and that can aid and assist with the movements that are going. And I really do think that we have to, as much as possible, get past the cancel culture thing. It's like Lenin said a long time ago that the spontaneous consciousness of the working class was like trade union consciousness. I think the spontaneous consciousness of networked individuals on a college campus is not trade union consciousness. It's very close to some of the cancellation consciousness that we see creep in, and so we have to have an active way of inoculating that kind of canceling dynamic so that people can continue to work together across differences and sell the newspaper with people that they hated, like they used to do in the old left-wing parties or whatever, like
Good old days.
that was the famous cliche about left-wing parties, was that you could go and sell the newspaper with people and you fundamentally didn't like them, but you were consensed on political issues, and so you felt solidarity. I think that sometimes solidarity is felt too much to be a personalistic solidarity, whereas it means for old socialists like us, it means class solidarity, which is as wide as basically humanity, or potentially as wide as humanity, excluding the capitalists. Okay, obviously. Anyway, okay. Okay, thanks for the conversation.
All right, guys.